The telephone rang twice, once for the living, once for the dead. I lifted the receiver with chalk still dusting my fingertips, the smell of hot metal and barley tea hanging in the summer air of our lab. Outside, cicadas drilled the noon like tiny machines that had forgotten how to stop. Inside, our cyclotron idled in a sullen silence, its demagnetized heart a curved, quiet moon. The voice on the line came in bursts, each syllable straining through static and distance. A single B, 29, over Hiroshima. No rave, no squall. One. Then a flash white. Reports, total destruction. I repeat, total. Who is this? I asked, though I knew. Captain Mori from the weather station at Kure, the one who still called me Sensei, because once in a lecture hall, I had spoken about clouds that were not clouds. Mori, he said. We felt the wind here like a slap. Windows gone. We thought an ammunition depot in the city went off. But the flash, Kenji, it was like the sun fell down and stood back up again. He used my given name. On the telephone, in wartime, that was indecent. It made my blood go cold. Was there an air raid warning? I said, any droning in waves? Any Pathfinder flares? Nothing. One plane at altitude. We watched it draw a slim white thread, and then he stopped. On the line. Something clicked, perhaps a clerk listening on the other end, or perhaps fear itself acquiring hands. I have to go, Mori said. The barometer, it jumped. The line died. My laboratory returned to itself. 3 benches, a wall of shelves with reagents we stretched like thin paper, a blackboard crowded with circular scribbles, cross-sections, mean free paths, the name of every isotope I still loved written in a script that had learned to be careful. Outside the window, school children marched past 2 by 2, their voices light, their lunch pails dull. I stared at the cyclotron housings as if they would answer me. They stared back, mute steel arcs bolted to the concrete, faithful as dogs we had neglected. August 6th, 1945. At 8:15 in the morning, the sky over Hiroshima had done something no sky should do. At 11:07 in Tokyo, Captain Mori's voice told me what my bones had already begun to understand. I set the receiver down and pressed both hands to the bench. The lacquer was smooth where 1,000 anxious palms had polished it. Beyond the door, the corridor coughed and then spit a pair of boots. An adjutant from the Army's research liaison, his tunic salt-stained, the gold thread at his collar frayed. He did not knock. He entered as if all doors were air. Dr. Takahashi, he said. Yes, I am Kenji Takahashi, formerly of Kyoto University, now of Riken in Tokyo, once a student of men who built instruments from dreams and scrap metal, and now, in the 17th season of this war, a physicist who measured with Abysai because glass tubes were too precious to break. Headquarters request your presence, he said. There has been an incident in Hiroshima. In the corridor, the air had a sweetness to it, an odd note like hot pennies in rain, even though the day was dry. I told myself I imagined it. We moved through stairwells where notices begged for paper and bottles for the nation. Every door wore someone's small desperation, a family name, a lucky character, a sprig of evergreen. On the second landing, a porter bowed, so low his cap nearly fell off. Have you heard? He whispered. Go back to your station, the adjutant snapped. In the car, Tokyo slid by in an orderly blur. Bicycles, women with white cloths tied around their hair, men who walked with their hands behind their backs as if handcuffed by their thoughts. The city smelled of rice husks and coal. The driver swung us down avenues where the trees had been painted with lime to discourage pests. The trunks glowed like damp bones. At Army General Staff, the air was too cold. They had saved the coolness for themselves. The rationed electricity hummed in the ceiling like a tamed hive. We were ushered into a small room with maps on every wall. Hiroshima's name was circled in red pencil as if a child had done it. 3 men waited. A colonel with the face of a ledger, a civilian in a gray suit with cuffs shiny from habit, and My stomach lurched. Professor Hayashi from my student days, summoned now as a consultant, his hair thinner, his eyes the same careful brown. Sit, the colonel said. Dr. Takahashi, Professor Hayashi. We need to know what we are facing. What do you know? Hayashi asked softly. The gray-suited man looked at the map rather than at us. Hiroshima has suffered unprecedented damage from a new type of bomb. Communications are sparse. Railway telegraph lines cut. From radio observers. One aircraft at high altitude, then a brilliant flash, then a pressure wave unlike a conventional blast. Fires everywhere. A mushroom cloud. Someone used those words. Mushroom, the colonel repeated, almost contemptuous. Poetic nonsense. Perhaps not nonsense, Hayashi said, and did not smile. He turned toward me. His gaze did a familiar thing. It invited me to be honest, and it warned me that honesty would cost. What do you think, Kenji? He said, old familiarity covering my name like a tatama mat. Gun type? Implosion? Uranium? Plutonium? Or an accident at a depot after all? The room was silent except for the drone of the ceiling fan, and, beneath that, the tick of the colonel's pen against his knuckles. I saw again the curved magnet yoke of our cyclotron at Riken, all potential and no current, and the chalk on my own fingers. One plane, I said. One bomb. A flash brighter than the sun. A pressure wave that reaches Kure. Fires in all directions. If the report is even half true, gentlemen, I looked at each of them and felt the floor tip a little under my feet. Then this is a nuclear detonation. The colonel laughed once, a dry cough. Doctor, you exaggerate. Doi. I said, General, until this morning I would have called it improbable myself. But physics is not a matter of pride. It is a matter of what atoms desire. The signs are what they are. The gray-suited man swallowed. And how could they? Uranium, 235, I said. Possibly plutonium, 239, but more likely uranium for a first field use. A gun-type assembly is technically simpler. Two subcritical masses driven together by conventional explosives in a gun barrel. If they have the fissile material. If the colonel said. The word dangled between us. The hope in it was almost shameful. We have consulted many capable men. They all told us the same. To separate enough uranium-235 from uranium-238 would require factories the size of cities. We cannot build that. They cannot build that. We have considered heavy water, graphite moderators, centrifuges. There are always shortages, always sabotaged by reality itself. The Americans will be no better than we are. I watched Hayashi lift his hand toward the blackboard. He drew a circle, then a smaller one inside it, then a dozen arrows pointing inward, chalk comets racing toward a moon. Critical mass, he murmured. Mean free path. Cross-section. And I measured these numbers when the windows still had glass. I took the chalk from him before the colonel could object. My hand remembered its older boldness. A gun-type device requires, for uranium, a mass on the order of tens of kilograms enriched above 80%. Fewer if you tamper and reflect efficiently. The yield, given the reports of destruction, could be 15 to 20 kilotons. That flash suggests a fireball radius of, call it 200 meters. The blast pattern, if we had it, would tell us more. But the single plane, I wrote one on the board as if the number itself were an accusation, suggests a weapon whose effect is independent of 1,000 bomber stream. Sir, forgive me, but there are not enough ammunition depots in Hiroshima to make the sky behave like that. The colonel scowled. And if, Doctor, you happen to be right, what then? What do you recommend I tell my superiors? That the Americans have built the impossible? That we surrender because your equations are full of doom? I placed the chalk down with more care than necessary. Tell them, I said, and felt my own voice surprise me with its steadiness, that we have fatally underestimated American capacity, industrial, scientific, and moral, if the word may be used for such a thing. Tell them to expect another. Tell them we must verify what physics suggests. Send us to Hiroshima. The colonel's face did something that men's faces do when they hear truth they wish they had not ordered. It closed like a shutter. He turned to the gray-suited man. Arrange transport, he said. A reconnaissance team. Doctors, physicists, Geiger counters, if any remain in this country. Dosimeters. Film. Film. Hayashi asked. For shadows. I said before I could stop myself. If such a device has been used, there will be shadows left where human bodies once were. We will need to record them. The world should know. The word world hung in the air like a heron. We were not allowed that word in wartime. He let it pass. Go, the colonel said. Be on the train by dusk. We will procure permissions along the way. Outside, the cicadas sang a new song I did not recognize. The city gleamed with an ordinary summer brightness that felt obscene. On the steps of General Staff, a clerk paused me with a battered Geiger counter so old I wanted to laugh. He handed it to me like a lantern in a cave. It works? I asked. He shrugged. It clicks. Back at the laboratory, I gathered what we had. A notebook with squared pages, our last unexposed 35mm film, cotton masks meant for dust and hope, a lead pig for storing samples if we could find any. I opened the steel door to the cyclotron vault and stood for a breath in its cool, aneurysmal hush, as if I were apologizing to a sleeping animal I could not protect. I laid my hand on the magnet yoke. You were supposed to teach me everything slowly, I told it. Forgive them for teaching me like this. On my bench, a telegram had arrived in my absence, its paper thin as onion skin. It was from Kyoto, my mother's neighbor, written in a hesitant hand. Your mother asks if you are well. She says the sky looked strange this morning. I folded it carefully and put it in my breast pocket like a charm against fire. We boarded the evening train south with the sun flattened to a red coin on the horizon. The compartments smelled of hemp rope and tired people. In the corridor outside our seats, a nurse sat cross-legged on a small trunk, counting out ampoules like prayer beads. In our luggage rack lay the Geiger counter inside a biscuit tin, our camera with its single roll, cotton masks, a thermos of tea, 3 rice balls wrapped in paper that would become important later simply because they existed. Hayashi sat across from me, his hat on his knees, his eyes turned to the window and the moving mirror of the countryside. Fields, rivers, villages whose lights blinked reluctantly on. Do you remember, he said without turning, when you told me in 41 that if anyone used a fission device, it would not be us? I asked why. You said, not for lack of cleverness, for lack of audacity and copper and faith. I do, I said. I have been arrogant and also perhaps, right? I thought the Americans too cautious, too moralistic to spend a nation's wealth on a single bomb. And I thought them incapable of building a factory the size of a city just to separate an isotope. I watched the straight rows of patties pass like combed hair. I was wrong. We were all wrong, Hayashi said. He smiled a little, and then the smile went away. Do you think it was uranium? He asked again, as if my answer could be improved by repetition. I think so, I said. Plutonium would require a different kind of assembly, a more complex implosion, for a first demonstration in combat. And given the single plane, the Americans would have chosen a design they trusted not to fizzle. Uranium makes a cynic out of caution. But I hesitated. The thought had been sitting in me all afternoon like a stone. If it was plutonium, then somewhere a nation built a reactor to make it, a chemical reprocessing plant to harvest it, and an assembly device to make it work. Either way, we misjudged them. Hayashi clicked his tongue. We misjudged something else too. The time it takes for shame to ripen. We rode in silence for a while. A child in the next compartment sang to herself softly. The train's wheels pronounced a sentence in an old, cold language on the rails. You knew, you knew, you knew. Just before midnight, a sergeant came through with an order. The line to Hiroshima was broken. We would disembark at a junction and wait for trucks to take us closer. In the dark, we stumbled over bags and sleeping men, our biscuits tin knocking against my knee with a domestic clatter that made me hate it and love it. On the platform, a warm wind pressed against my face. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once as if to announce us to the gods. We did not sleep. We sat on our cases in a dim waiting room that smelled of old bread and damp straw. A telegraph machine in the office rattled like a trapped insect. The station master's face had taken on the blankness of men who could no longer afford the intimacy of expression. He brought us hot water for tea and told us nothing because he knew nothing. At 2 in the morning, a corporal arrived with a truck and cigarettes he did not share. We climbed into bed with 2 surgeons, a chemist from Osaka, and a woman whose badge said she was from the Red Cross, but whose eyes said she was all of us. The road south unspooled under the headlights in a narrow ribbon of dust. Every bridge was a person whose bones we drove across. In the east, a pale bruise of light collected. That trick the night performs to make you think dawn will be kind. We stopped at a checkpoint where young men with rifles tried to look like older men with rifles. One peered into our cargo and touched the biscuit tin. "What's that?" he asked. "It clicks," I said. He blinked, laughed once, and waved us on, as if he had been handed a riddle he could afford to misplace. At dawn, the wind turned. It brought us a scent that stopped the conversation in our throats. A sweetness, yes, but behind it an iron note. Not blood, older than blood, like rain falling on a rusted bell. The Red Cross woman made a small sound in her throat, and I recognized it with a shock. It was the sound people made in the laboratory when a tube cracked and everyone understood the experiment was lost. The first people we met on the road had no shoes. They walked in a line, carrying bundles that surely weighed no more than their own hands. Their faces were the color of cooked soy. They did not look at us. They looked at a point inside themselves where perhaps a room was still intact. We chose not to stop because we had been told to get to Hiroshima quickly so we could be told to stop. The road bent, widened, narrowed. We passed a field of sunflowers so vivid they might have been painted on the air. Then, around a low hill, the sky became a thing I will never finish describing. It rose like a pillar in the distance, and yet there was nothing solid about it. The column had the color of a bruise and the shape of an argument with heaven. At its top it curled and billowed, white against blue, a parody of a tree. The surgeons did not speak. The corporal slowed the truck without meaning to. The Red Cross woman put her hand on my arm and did not move it for a full minute. I lifted the Geiger counter from its tin. I switched it on. It began to talk at once, a slow chatter, then faster. Click, 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 click. The corporal glanced at me, and I could not help it. I laughed, not because I was happy, but because the last of the deniability had been removed from the world as neatly as a bandage. Hayashi leaned close enough that I could feel his breath. "Well," he said. His voice shook. "It clicks," I said. We both heard the sacrilege and did not care. We drove into the outskirts, houses that were not houses anymore, fire where there had been rice, water where there should have been roads. The heat pressed down, a weight without hands. Somewhere, a bell rang without rhythm. We passed a wall where a ladder leaned and where, on the steps, a pale silhouette clung. A place where absence had been burned into presence. Hayashi stopped the truck with a shout and jumped down. He stood before the shadow and lifted his hand and did not touch it. "Photograph it," he said very quietly. I loaded the camera with fingers I was surprised to find were still mine. The shutter sighed. The film drank what it could. The Geiger counter muttered. In a narrow canal, fish turned their white bellies to the sun in a chorus of punctuation. A child sat on a stoop and held a wooden soldier whose paint had bubbled into a blistered grin. The Red Cross woman knelt by him and spoke not words but a tone, the way one speaks to dogs and ghosts. At the university, the physics building still had a crown of bricks that pretended to be a roof. Inside, The air was dust and linen. On a table, I found a page torn from a notebook. Integrals, a scatter of Greek letters, a doodle of a cat. I slipped it into my pocket without knowing why. In the courtyard lay a metallic thing that looked like the innards of a clock grown large and ugly. I did not know what it was, and then I did. The remnants of an air raid siren, throat torn out. We collected a soil sample, a fragment of roof tile, a handful of blackened rain that had turned the gutters into script. We measured here, there, everywhere. The counter's voice rose and felt like a story told badly by someone in a hurry. In a clinic that had lost its walls but kept its beds, a woman held a melted rosary and asked me whether the Americans had learned this from us or from the Germans. I told her the truth, from themselves. She nodded as if that answer had been supplied to her before I arrived. Near the river, a man in a dockworker's cap put his hand on my sleeve and pulled me toward the water. He pointed at the current. "The dead go faster than the living," he said, as if he were making a joke for a friend who had heard it many times and would hear it again. I wanted to be sick, but my body refused me even that. We took our notes. We took our measurements. We took nothing else. We did not take explanations because there were too many of them and not enough of us. At noon, we stood by a broken fence and ate our rice balls without tasting them. Nearby, a patch of grass burned without flame. The sky was a sheet of hammered tin. In the late afternoon, a courier on a bicycle arrived from Kure with a packet in oilskin. He had a gash at his knee that he did not notice. He handed me the packet and bent over his handlebars as if the earth had suddenly doubled in size. Inside the packet, an order to return to Tokyo at once with findings, a memorandum from the General Staff authorizing our use of telegraph lines, a second, smaller note in pencil, and signed, that said only, "Expect a second attack." 3 days. I handed the little note to Hayashi. He read it and made a sound I had never heard him make, something between a sob and a laugh. The noise of a man who has been told that the world has a schedule. We filled a final page. We labeled our little jars with tiny letters because our hands were too big for the work. We wrapped the film as if it were an infant. We turned in a slow circle like men who had to make sure they were not alone on a stage by mistake. As we left the university grounds, I looked back at the pale shadow on the steps, and it looked back in the way that all witnesses do who will never speak. At the edge of the city, where the fields resumed their agreement with the sky, Hayashi stopped, put his hand on the tailgate of the truck, and looked at me. He had a way, always, of turning into my teacher at the exact moment I needed and did not deserve one. "We were wrong," he said, and his voice was gentle and merciless. We did not believe the Americans could do this. We did not believe the atoms would allow it. We did not believe our own warnings when they were still ink and not ash. We underestimated, fatally, another nation's patience and its machinery. We must tell the truth now, Kenji. We must tell it even if it is a rope, and we are the neck. I thought of the colonel's shuttered face, of the clerk's careful bow, of the porter with his cap cocked like a beggar's ear. I thought of our cyclotron asleep in Tokyo, of the magnet that wanted current like a horse wants pasture. I thought of the telegram in my pocket about my mother and the strange sky in Kyoto. I thought of the note in pencil that had a number in its belly like a loaded shell. 3 days. "Tell the truth," I said, "and send more counters." We climbed into the truck as the light failed. The road north had not become softer. At a crossroads, a man with a red flag and a bandaged eye stopped us and asked where we were going. "Tokyo," I said, "with news. Carry it gentle," he said, as if it were an egg, and waved us through. Just past the checkpoint where the trees closed in and the evening smelled of sap and soot, we met a convoy heading south. Medical trucks, men in armbands, a priest on a bicycle with his robes tucked up and his knees flashing pale. In the moment when we drew abreast, he looked up and caught my eye. He lifted 2 fingers in blessing or arithmetic. I could not tell which. The Geiger counter in the biscuit tin clicked twice in answer. Night rose. Stars appeared, their distances altering nothing. In the back of the truck, The Red Cross woman slept sitting up with her hands folded on a metal box. Hayashi stared at the road behind us, as if it might change shape. The corporal lit a cigarette and then remembered the ration and put it out. I held the counter in my lap and listened to its slow, patient talk until I began to hear other ticks inside it that were not there. Our own faults, clicking. Near midnight, the truck sputtered and coughed. We rolled to a stop by a shrine where a rope hung with paper zigzag swayed in a wind I could not feel. The corporal swore, lifted the hood, swore again. "Feel line," he said. We wait. We waited. The shrine bell made a sound the size of a teardrop. In the trees, insects argued. I took the small notebook from my coat and wrote in it not numbers, but a sentence I did not know I had wanted to write all day. If the world survives, it will surprise me by the manner in which it does so. Hayashi leaned against the truck and closed his eyes. "Do you think," he said, "that if we had succeeded first, we would have used it?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to say that our better angels had not been leased to the army. But I remembered as well the excitement in our own voices when we spoke of fission in those first years of possibility, our arguments about purity, not ethics, but graphite. "We will never know," I said. It was true, and it was a lie. The corporal kicked the tire with the kind of ingenuity that often makes a miracle. The engine coughed, caught like a man learning to breathe again. We started forward. The shrine and its paper lightning slid into the dark behind us. An hour later, as we passed a field of sleeping millet, a wind rose from the southwest, a soft hand on the back of the neck. It brought with it a light dust, so fine it was not dust but taste. On my tongue, it had the flavor of matches blown out. On my skin, it had the feeling of chalk. The Red Cross woman woke and touched her lips and did not like what they told her. I held the counter to the night and listened. It clicked softly like a storehouse accounting for what had been taken. We arrived at the junction before dawn. The station master there did not blink when we said Hiroshima and nuclear in the same breath. He poured us tea that had forgotten what leaves were. He showed us a telegram that had arrived an hour earlier, and that was not for us and was for us. New type bomb hurled on Hiroshima. Annihilating effect. Second use possible. America demands surrender. He had underlined possible 3 times. Beneath it, in a hand too careful for a clerk, someone had written 3 days. On the platform, I set the biscuit tin on my knee and opened it. The counter inside looked up at me like a small animal we had coaxed from a trap. I stroked its case with my thumb and wondered what I would do when the click stopped meaning anything. Hayashi, beside me, cracked his knuckles and said nothing. The first train of the morning arrived with an exhausted shriek. We climbed aboard with our jars and our film and our grief. As the wheels began again to recite their sentence on the rails, the Red Cross woman asked me a question no one had asked me yet. "Doctor," she said, "when you write your report, will you tell them only the physics?" I looked out at a landscape that had decided to be beautiful despite the day. "No," I said. "I will tell them that we miscalculated the number of magnets and the number of prayers. I will tell them the Geiger counter clicked in a place where no instrument should ever have to speak. I will tell them that a shadow on a stair is a kind of scripture. I will tell them we underestimated not just American factories, but the appetite of the century." She nodded and closed her eyes as if she were finally permitted to. I closed mine too, for 3 breaths. When I opened them, the sky to the east was rinsed and pale, and somewhere very far away a bell was ringing morning like a promise it intended to keep. At Ueno Station, Tokyo's damp breath welcomed us back. The city had not changed because one city had, but men's faces had acquired a new effort. We delivered the film. We delivered the samples. We delivered ourselves into a room of maps and already chewed pencils. The colonel read our report with the expression of a man drinking a cup he thought was water and finding it filled with sea. Hayashi stood at the blackboard, and for the first time in a long time, no one interrupted him when he wrote. I placed the little jars in a row like an apology. When we had done, The colonel tapped the pencil against the paper until the eraser had nothing left to lose. "Thank you," he said. He said it like a sentence given, not gratitude. "You have done your duty." We left. In the corridor, a young clerk put his head against the wall and said nothing. Outside, the sky performed its ordinary morning blue. A boy on a bicycle wove around a cart of cabbage. A woman in a white kimono adjusted her sleeve. Everything was indecently intact. On the steps of the building, Hayashi turned to me. He adjusted his hat as if it needed to be taught something about humility. "I will see you tomorrow," he said. Unless he did not finish. "3 days," I said. He looked at me hard. "Then we have 2. We walked in opposite directions because that is what men do when they're trying not to look like companions in an unforgivable story. I returned to the laboratory. I unlocked the door. I stood in the shadow of the cyclotron and laid my hand on its cold flank and felt, for the first time since Captain Mori's call, the most selfish thought I would allow myself. That if our machine had run at full power in peacetime, life would be different now in ways I could catalog and in ways I could not bear to imagine. The telephone rang, once for the living, once for the dead. I lifted the receiver. A voice from the general staff said, "Dr. Takahashi, there is an urgent message from intelligence about aerial reconnaissance. They report." The voice hesitated, as if reluctant to believe its own mouth. "They report that the Americans have a second device ready." "I know," I said. "Doctor," the voice continued, suddenly younger, suddenly human. "They say it is not a bluff." I thought of the note in pencil. I thought of the 2 days the bell and the rail had allotted us. I thought of the shadow on the stairs and of the Geiger counter's soft, patient clicks like rain that had learned arithmetic. "Nothing about this is a bluff," I said. Then the voice said, "What do we do?" I looked at our silent machine, at the chalkboard with its little moons and arrows, at the sunlight falling on the bench top as if it did not know where it was. I did not say surrender into the Army's telephone. I did not say it because men die for the sake of words, and it was not my word to use. I said instead the only sentence that fit in my mouth and in the century. "We tell the truth faster," I said, "and we pray to be believed." In the hallway, footsteps approached, purposeful, many. I set the receiver down and wiped my hands on my coat. The cicadas outside had not stopped. They pressed their insistence into the day, into me. I thought I heard in their call the tiniest variation, the hint of a new rhythm, and then I realized it was only my own blood in my ears. The door opened. "Dr. Takahashi," the adjutant said, "the General Staff requests that you brief a delegation at once. In particular, they want to know whether anything can be done in 3 days." I took out my notebook. I put the Geiger counter into the biscuit tin because there are talismans and then there are instruments, and sometimes the line between them is kindness. I followed him. In the corridor, the air held that odd sweetness again, the smell of hot pennies, of something invisible being born or burned. I looked up at the strip of blue through the stairwell window and counted the seconds between footfalls, as if time were something I could break into pieces and distribute to the people who needed it most. 3 days, I said to no one. Perhaps 2, perhaps 1. We turned the corner into the room of maps. I began again to speak the physics and the failure and the fraction of hope, measuring my words with the care of a man who knows that words, too, can fission. And somewhere, in a sky not yet marked, a second sun moved toward a city it would not choose and could not love.